Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Universe Night. Tonight we are not traveling among stars or galaxies. Tonight we are stepping into something smaller, and somehow just as vast, the quiet world of ancient herbs, the green and fragrant medicine that human hands have gathered since before the first written word existed to describe it. We will wander through candlelit apothecary shelves lined with dried bundles, their shapes soft and shadowed in low light. We will walk beside a Roman bather stepping into water scented with lavender, feeling the day dissolve from her shoulders. We will sit beside a monk in a walled garden at dawn, brushing dew from the leaves of plants he has tended for 20 patient years. We will follow a single dried root, dug from cold soil, carried across mountains in the pocket of a tired traveler, simply because it once made him feel warm again. These are not stories of urgency. There is no discovery to rush toward tonight, no danger to escape, no mystery demanding to be solved before morning. There is only the slow, patient knowledge of ordinary people who learned, one season at a time, which leaves could soothe a restless mind, which flowers could quiet a racing heart, and which roots could carry warmth through a long and difficult night. This knowledge was never loud. It passed quietly between grandmothers and daughters, between healers and apprentices, between one candle-lit kitchen and the next, for far longer than most of what we now call history. Let your shoulders soften now, wherever they happen to be resting. Let your jaw loosen just slightly, the way it does in the last unguarded moments before sleep arrives on its own, uninvited and welcome. Let your breathing slow, not forced, simply allowed, the way a river slows where the land begins to flatten. You do not need to hold on to anything tonight, not the day behind you, not the day still waiting ahead. Just this voice, and these old green stories, and the dark settling gently around you like a blanket someone warmed by a low, quiet fire. Nothing about tonight requires your effort. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to follow every detail, or hold onto every name, or stay awake long enough to hear how the story ends. These stories were never meant to be studied. They were meant to be received the way warmth is received from a fire, or comfort is received from a familiar voice in a dark room, passively, gently, without any work required of you at all. If you find comfort in these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And now, let the rest of the world fade quietly at the edges, until only this small candle-lit garden remains. Let's begin. There is a particular hour, somewhere between the last light of evening and true darkness, when ancient gardens seem to hold their breath. It was the hour healers often chose for gathering, not the bright noon sun, which could wilt a tender leaf before it ever reached a mortar and pestle, but this quieter, cooler hour, when the plants themselves seemed most willing to give up their fragrance. We will spend our night moving gently through 5 such gardens, 5 such hours, 5 such quiet acts of gathering, each one carried by ordinary hands doing something small and lasting. Chamomile once grew wild along the banks of the Nile, low and unassuming among taller reeds and stands of papyrus, and the healers of ancient Egypt noticed something in it long before anyone had a word for chemistry. They saw a small white flower with a golden center, easy to overlook, easy to walk past without a second glance. Yet they began to gather it anyway, drying its blossoms in the shade and steeping them in warm water for those who could not settle, the fevered, the anxious, the sleepless child who would not stop crying in the dim hours before dawn. The Egyptians came to associate this flower with the sun itself, dedicating it to their sun god, perhaps because its golden heart resembled a tiny captured light, ringed in soft white petals like the corona around a distant star. It was pressed into gentle ointments for irritated skin. It was laid among offerings in temple courtyards, treated with a quiet reverence usually reserved for things far larger than a single flower. It was trusted, generation after generation, as a plant that could take the sharp edges off a difficult day, smoothing them the way a slow current smooths a stone. There is something quietly moving in the idea that a flower small enough to overlook became one of the most trusted calming herbs in the ancient world. It did not announce itself with size or brilliant color the way a lotus or a rose might. It simply worked, season after season, until healers noticed a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Imagine a mother in a mud brick house near the river, crushing dried chamomile heads between her palms long after sunset, releasing a scent like apples warmed slowly in afternoon sunlight, before pouring hot water over them for a child who cannot stop crying. She does not know the word flavonoid. She has never heard of a compound binding gently to receptors in a nervous system that will not be fully understood for another 3,000 years. She only knows from the women who taught her that this flower, steeped just so, brings quiet into a room that badly needs it. Egyptian medical papyri, painstakingly copied by scribes onto fragile sheets that somehow survived thousands of years of sand and silence, mention plant remedies alongside instructions for the body and the mind together, as though the two had never truly been separate categories at all. Chamomile likely moved among these remedies quietly, one small entry among many, never singled out as extraordinary, simply included because it was known, because it was trusted, because someone before the scribe had already tested it and found it worth passing on. There is no record of who first noticed that this particular flower calmed a racing heart. That person's name is lost entirely, folded into the anonymous mass of everyone who ever quietly helped someone else feel better and never thought to record their own part in it. That knowledge did not stay buried in one river valley, tucked away and forgotten. It traveled outward with trade routes, with migrations, with the slow, unhurried drift of human curiosity, until chamomile appeared again and again across different civilizations, always for roughly the same gentle purpose. A small offering of calm, brewed in warm water, held carefully in cupped hands before sleep. Even now, in kitchens scattered across every continent, someone is doing almost exactly what an Egyptian healer did beside the Nile thousands of years ago, at almost exactly the same hour of the evening. The gesture has not changed at all, only the cup has. It is worth pausing on that thought as your own body begins, slowly, to settle. A plant this humble, this easily overlooked in a field of taller and showier growth, has been quietly present at the edge of human rest for longer than most of our recorded history. That is not a small thing to consider in the dark. It is a gentle reminder that comfort has never needed to be loud or dramatic or announced in order to be entirely real. There is a particular texture to dried chamomile that anyone who has ever held it will remember without trying, a papery softness, almost weightless in the palm, the small petals curling faintly inward like something caught mid-thought. Ancient hands would have known this texture intimately, sorting flower heads from stems by feel alone in low light, working by touch the way a person today might sort laundry half asleep, without needing to look down. There was no rush in this work. Drying chamomile properly took days spread across clean cloth in shaded air, turned occasionally, watched over the way a person watches over something that cannot be hurried into being ready. And perhaps that is part of why chamomile became so trusted as a companion to rest. Everything about its preparation asked for patience. There was no shortcut to a good cup of it, no way to rush the drying, no way to force the golden centers to release their calm any faster than they were willing to. In an ancient world with far less artificial light, far fewer distractions pulling attention in 100 directions at once, perhaps that unhurried process was itself part of the medicine, the simple, repeated act of slowing down enough to prepare something gently, for no reason other than someone else's comfort. Later, in monasteries scattered across a very different landscape, monks kept small chamomile beds within the walls of their herb gardens, tending them alongside mint, sage, and rue, in neat rows separated by gravel paths worn smooth by decades of unhurried footsteps. A monk walking those paths at dusk, checking on his plants before the evening bell, would have known each chamomile bed the way a person knows the layout of a familiar room in the dark, by memory, by habit, by the quiet comfort of repetition. He was not thinking, most likely, of ancient Egypt or of temples beside a river he had never seen. He was thinking only of tomorrow's tea, and of the elderly brother in the infirmary who had not been sleeping well. That is, in the end, how most old knowledge survives at all, not through grand proclamation, but through small, repeated, almost invisible acts of care, passed forward by people who never intended to be remembered themselves, only to be useful quietly to whoever came after them. Somewhere tonight, someone else is likely doing the very same thing, warming water, reaching for dried flowers, preparing a small, unremarkable act of comfort for someone they love, without ever knowing how far back that simple gesture truly reaches. Lavender carries its own kind of memory, and much of that memory belongs to water. In ancient Rome, bathhouses were far more than places to become clean. They were places of gathering, of unwinding, of letting the noise of public life dissolve slowly into rising steam and cool stone. And into that water, again and again, went lavender, its purple spikes gathered from sun-warmed hillsides, dried in bundles, and scattered or steeped until the surrounding air itself carried its scent through every corridor. Some historians even trace the very name lavender to the Latin word lavare, meaning to wash, as though the plant and the act of bathing had become inseparable from one another in language itself, long before anyone thought to separate them. Long before it reached the bathhouses, lavender grew wild across the dry hillsides of the western Mediterranean, tangled among rosemary and thyme in landscapes that received little rain and less shade. Shepherds moving their flocks across those hills would have walked through it daily, their sandals and the legs of their animals brushing against the flowering spikes, releasing clouds of fragrance into the hot afternoon air without anyone intending it at all. It is likely that lavender's calming reputation began this way, informally, long before any physician wrote it down, simply from generations of people who noticed that the hillsides smelling most strongly of lavender were also, somehow, the places where they felt most at ease. Picture the low hum of voices in a Roman bathhouse, softened almost to a murmur by tile and rising steam. Picture a woman lowering herself slowly into warm water scented faintly with lavender, feeling the tightness in her neck and shoulders begin to loosen before she has even noticed it happening. The herb was never simply decorative there. It was functional, deeply trusted, woven into the very architecture of rest the way a modern person might trust a particular blanket or a particular quiet room at the end of a long day. Soldiers reportedly carried dried lavender with them as well, using it to help clean and soothe wounds, and to calm their own nerves after the chaos and noise of battle, tucking a plant known for gentleness into lives that were, so often, anything but gentle. There is a kind of quiet poetry in that pairing, the harshness of a soldier's world standing side by side with the softness of a small purple flower, violence and stillness, existing in the very same historical moment, answering the very same ancient human need for relief. Lavender did not erase what a person had lived through, of course. It could not undo a battle or a hard year or a difficult loss. It simply offered a pause, a scented breath, a brief moment in which the nervous system could remember faintly what calm used to feel like. That pause may have mattered more than any single herb ever could on its own. Ancient life offered very few guaranteed moments of stillness, very few spaces set aside purely for rest without some other purpose attached. A bath scented with lavender was one of those rare spaces, sanctioned, expected, built into the rhythm of the week, rather than something a person had to justify or steal for themselves. Perhaps that permission, as much as the plant itself, is what people were truly seeking each time they stepped into that warm, fragrant water. Roman gardens grew lavender in careful rows near kitchen doors and bathhouse entrances, close enough that its fragrance would drift on the warm air whenever anyone passed. Children likely grew up with that scent as an unremarkable part of daily life, the way a modern child might grow up with the smell of laundry soap or fresh bread, never once suspecting that 2,000 years later, people on the far side of the world would still be reaching for the very same purple flower at the very same tired hour of the evening. That same plant still finds its way into pillows and warm baths tonight, still carrying, in some small unbroken thread of human habit, the same purpose it held on the hillsides above Roman villas so long ago. Nothing about its chemistry has changed in all that time. What has changed is only how far it has traveled and how many quiet hands have trusted it since. There is also something worth noticing in how lavender was harvested. Farmers along the Mediterranean coast learned to cut the stalks just as the flowers began to open, never fully bloomed, believing the fragrance to be strongest in that brief window between bud and full flower. It meant the harvest had to happen quickly, over a matter of days each summer, entire families moving through fields at dawn, while the air was still cool enough that the oils had not yet begun to evaporate under a rising sun. The scent that clung to their hands afterward would have lasted for days, a kind of quiet perfume earned through ordinary labor rather than luxury. It is a small thing, perhaps, to think of a farmer's rough hands smelling faintly of lavender at the end of a long harve. Esting day, the same fragrance that would later drift through a bathhouse built for senators and merchants far above his station. But herbs have always moved this way through history, indifferent to rank, offering the very same comfort to a field worker and to an emperor, asking nothing of either one except a willingness to notice. Physicians of the ancient world sometimes recommended lavender oil, rubbed gently onto the temples for those who could not settle their thoughts at night, a small quiet gesture that survives, almost unchanged, in how people still reach for lavender today when sleep refuses to come easily. There is something remarkable in a remedy surviving so completely intact across 2,000 years of changing medicine, changing language, changing everything else about how human beings understand their own bodies. Lavender simply continued doing what it had always done, patient and unbothered by the passing of empires around it. Lavender's reach did not stop at the edges of the Roman world. Long after the empire itself had faded into ruin and memory, medieval gardeners continued to grow it within the walled herb gardens of convents and monasteries, tucking it near walkways where the simple brush of a passing robe would release its fragrance into the cool morning air. Nuns and monks dried it in bunches hung from wooden beams, the way one might dry any other useful plant, and used it to freshen linens, to ease headaches, to calm restless patients resting in the quiet of a monastery infirmary. The bathhouses of Rome were long gone by then, crumbled and overgrown, Yet the plant itself carried on regardless, indifferent to the rise and fall of the empire that had once made it famous. There is something steadying in that continuity, the idea that a simple purple flower outlasted senators, outlasted emperors, outlasted an entire civilization's roads and laws and language, while still being gathered, dried, and trusted by ordinary hands for the very same gentle purpose it had always served. Sage was burned, not brewed, and that distinction matters more than it might first appear. Where chamomile and lavender found their place in warm water, sage most often found its place in smoke, rising in slow curling ribbons from small clay dishes in temples, homes, and gathering places across many ancient cultures at once. Its name descends from the Latin salver, to heal or to save, and healers across the Mediterranean world regarded it as something close to sacred, not simply a plant for the body, but a plant thought to clear the mind, sharpen memory, and restore a kind of inner clarity when thoughts had grown tangled, heavy, or difficult to hold. Sage held a particular place among the Romans as well, who considered it so valuable that gathering it required a kind of quiet ceremony of its own. Some ancient sources describe pickers approaching the plant barefoot, wearing clean garments, using a special blade rather than an ordinary knife, careful never to gather it with an iron tool, which was believed to diminish its virtue. Whether or not every household truly followed such careful rules, the mere existence of the custom tells us something important. This was not a plant treated casually. It was handled the way a person handles something they believe still carries, even in its dried and humble form, a trace of whatever quiet power first drew human attention to it. Consider the scene of an ancient healer kneeling before a small clay dish, laying dried sage leaves gently across warm coals with careful, unhurried fingers. The smoke that rises from those leaves is silvery, almost soft-edged in low candlelight, carrying a scent that is sharp and green and faintly resinous, something between a forest floor and a struck match. Those standing nearby would lean into that smoke, not to escape into unconsciousness, but to feel gathered, centered, present, the very opposite of scattered, anxious thought. Some physicians of the ancient world believed sage could preserve memory well into old age, and elders were sometimes encouraged to chew its leaves or drink slow infusions of it, trusting that this humble gray-green plant might hold back, even briefly, the quiet fog that so often arrives with passing years. There is something tender in imagining an elderly person, generations before medicine understood memory in any real sense, reaching for a single plant leaf out of hope rather than certainty, trusting a tradition passed down simply because it had, at least sometimes, seemed to work for someone they loved. Sage asked for nothing extraordinary in return. It only asked to be burned or steeped or slowly chewed, with patience and a kind of quiet faith. There is a particular quiet to a room where sage has recently been burned, not silence exactly, but a kind of settled stillness, as though the smoke itself had asked the air to slow down. Anyone who has walked into such a room, even without knowing why, might feel their own shoulders drop slightly, their own breathing ease, without being able to say precisely what had changed. Ancient people trusted that feeling completely, long before they had any framework for explaining it, simply because the feeling itself was so consistent, so reliably present. Every time the smoke rose from those small clay dishes. There were households where a small bundle of sage hung drying above the hearth for months at a time, filling the air with its scent whenever the fire was lit, so that the whole home carried a faint trace of clarity in every meal cooked beneath it. Guests would have noticed that smell without quite knowing why it felt so steadying, the way a familiar scent can calm a stranger without any explanation at all. Even today, sage smoke drifts through certain rituals in various cultures around the world, carrying forward, in fragrance if nothing else, an old and steady belief that clarity can be something you breathe in, slowly, on purpose, at the tired end of a long day. Sage grew easily along dry, sun-warmed hillsides, requiring little water and little tending, which may be part of why it appeared so consistently across cultures that otherwise shared very little else. It did not demand rich soil or careful irrigation. It simply grew, quietly resilient, in places where many other plants struggled to survive at all. Perhaps ancient people noticed this resilience too, and let it shape their trust in the plant. A herb that thrived under difficulty seemed a fitting companion for minds that were themselves struggling through difficulty, searching for some small foothold of clarity. There is a certain calm in that association, in imagining sage not as some rare and delicate treasure requiring special conditions, but as something sturdy and unremarkable, growing at the edges of dusty paths, waiting patiently to be gathered by anyone who thought to bend down and take a handful. The most trusted remedies in the ancient world were very rarely the rarest ones. More often, they were the ones that grew close by, season after season, reliable as the turning of the year itself. Greek and Roman writers alike recorded sage among their most valued garden plants, listing it carefully alongside other herbs believed essential to a well-kept household. It was not unusual for a physician of the ancient world to recommend sage for an almost bewildering range of complaints: sore throats, digestive troubles, fevers, and above all, that persistent sense of mental fog that seemed to trouble people then just as it troubles people now, at the end of long, demanding days. Whatever the precise ailment, sage was often the first plant reached for, trusted the way a familiar friend is trusted before a stranger, simply because it had proven itself useful so many times before. A household without sage growing somewhere nearby would have seemed, to many ancient families, oddly unprepared for the ordinary difficulties of daily life. It was less a luxury than a quiet necessity, tucked into a corner of nearly every kitchen garden, waiting patiently for whichever small crisis the week might bring. Ginger root traveled further than almost any other ancient remedy, carried not in temples or bathhouses, but in the pockets and packs of merchants, sailors, and travelers moving along vast trade routes that stretched from Southeast Asia toward the Mediterranean and far beyond. It was prized for something very simple and very human: warmth. Not the warmth of a fire crackling nearby, but an internal warmth, a settling of the stomach, a soothing of nausea during long and difficult journeys across uncertain land and uncertain sea. Ginger's earliest cultivation likely began in the warm, humid regions of what is now southern China and Southeast Asia, where farmers learned to coax the nobbled root from the earth long before it ever touched a Mediterranean table. From there, it moved slowly outward along overlapping networks of trade, passing through the hands of countless middlemen, each one adding a small margin of profit and a small distance of travel, until a root grown in a tropical garden might eventually be chewed by a shivering sailor in an entirely different climate on the far side of the known world, neither one ever aware of the other's existence. Picture a trader on a swaying wooden ship somewhere along an ancient spice route, his stomach uneasy after weeks at sea, reaching into a small cloth pouch for a dried piece of ginger root to chew slowly as the horizon tilts and rolls beneath him. There was real comfort in that small, sharp, warming bite, a comfort that could make the difference between a miserable voyage and a merely uncomfortable one. Ancient Chinese physicians documented ginger's warming properties centuries before it became familiar in European kitchens, describing it carefully as a root that could settle a troubled digestive system, and by gentle extension, calm a troubled body overall. There is something fitting in the fact that a plant meant to steady travelers eventually became a fixture of comfort itself far from any road or ship. It appeared in warm teas offered to the unwell, in thin slices steeped for those recovering slowly from illness, in the quiet ritual of preparing something soothing for someone who is not feeling entirely well and simply needs to be cared for. Ginger did not promise excitement of any kind. It promised steadiness instead, a kind of grounded warmth that made difficult movement through an uncertain world just slightly easier to bear, one small sip at a time. Even the word comfort seems to fit ginger more naturally than almost any other ancient herb we will meet tonight. It never claimed to heal in any dramatic sense. It only claimed to make the passage through difficulty a little gentler, a little warmer, a little more bearable, which is, perhaps, all any of us are really asking for on a hard night such as this one. A warm root, a warm cup, a small and steady comfort passed quietly from one tired traveler to the next, across centuries of roads and tides we will never fully know the names of. Along the old trade roads, ginger was sometimes worth more than its modest size would suggest, wrapped carefully and guarded the way something precious is guarded, not because it was rare in the way gold was rare, but because it was trusted, and trust, among travelers facing long, uncertain distances, was its own kind of currency. Even now, a cup of ginger tea carries forward that same ancient function, a small warming comfort offered to a body that has traveled too far, worked too hard, or simply needs, for a little while, to feel gently and quietly held. Ginger's knobbled, irregular shape made it easy to recognize even among a merchant's crowded stores of unfamiliar goods, and its pungent smell would have announced itself the moment a sack was opened, cutting through the mingled scents of salt water, tar, and old rope on a trading vessel. Sailors far from home, surrounded by unfamiliar languages and unfamiliar coastlines, could still reach for something as simple and consistent as a piece of dried ginger root, its warmth unchanged no matter how far they had drifted from anything familiar. There is a quiet steadiness in that image, a small root, plain and unglamorous to look at, becoming a kind of anchor for people whose entire lives were defined by constant movement. It asked for nothing complicated. It required no ritual, no special preparation, no particular hour of the day. It simply needed to be chewed or steeped or added to a simmering pot, and it would do quietly and reliably exactly what it had always done for travelers before. By the time ginger reached the markets of the ancient Mediterranean world, it had already passed through countless hands, countless ships, countless small transactions in languages its original growers had never heard spoken. It arrived wrapped, dried, sometimes candied in honey to preserve it for the long final stretch of its journey, a small root carrying within it the story of an entire trade network stretching further than any single traveler could ever personally witness. Physicians in Greece and later in Rome began recommending it much as their counterparts in China already had, for warmth, for digestion, for the particular unsettled feeling that came after a long and difficult journey of any kind. It is worth imagining, for a moment, just how strange and valuable a nobbled root from so far away must have seemed to someone who had never left their own small town, and yet, once tasted, once felt working its slow warmth through a troubled stomach, its origin mattered less than its effect. Comfort, it turns out, has always traveled well across even the widest cultural distances. Ginger was sometimes sliced thin and dried in the sun before its long voyage, curling slightly as it lost moisture, turning a pale golden brown that made it easy to store in small jars or wrapped cloth bundles for months at a time without spoiling. This durability was part of its appeal to travelers in particular, since so many other remedies wilted, rotted, or lost their potency long before a difficult journey was over. Ginger simply waited, patient and unchanged, ready to be steeped or chewed whenever it was finally needed, regardless of how many weeks or months had passed since it left the ground. Rosemary was once tucked behind the ears of Greek students preparing for their examinations, not for its scent alone, but for what that scent was believed to do: sharpen memory, steady focus, and quiet the anxious static of a mind under pressure. Ancient Greek scholars associated rosemary so closely with memory and mental clarity that they wore small sprigs of it while studying, weaving it into simple garlands, letting its sharp evergreen fragrance settle slowly into their thinking. The way a familiar smell can settle permanently into a memory itself. Rosemary thrived in the same dry, sun-baked soil that lavender and sage preferred, and the three plants likely grew tangled together on many hillsides, their fragrances mingling on the warm afternoon air into something layered and complex, impossible to fully separate into individual scents. A person walking those hills in ancient Greece would have breathed in all three at once: memory, calm, and clarity, growing side by side without any need for a gardener to plan it that way. Nature, it seems, had already arranged its own small pharmacy long before anyone thought to name the individual plants within it or study each one separately. Imagine a young scholar in ancient Athens, sitting beneath the dappled shade of an olive tree, with a small rosemary sprig resting behind one ear, reciting passages quietly under his breath, trusting that the plant resting so close to his skin was somehow helping the words stay in place. It is easy now to smile gently at that old belief, and yet modern research has returned, again and again, to rosemary's aromatic compounds and their surprising relationship with alertness and recall. A strange, faint echo of something ancient students only ever sensed, without ever being able to prove it in any formal way. Rosemary also held a place near the hearth, near the home, near remembrance of an entirely different kind. It was placed gently at gravesides in some ancient traditions, a small evergreen reminder that memory itself does not have to fade simply because a person has gone. Mourners would sometimes carry a sprig home afterward, tucking it somewhere quiet, as though carrying a small piece of remembrance back into daily life. In this way, rosemary carried a double meaning across many centuries: memory of facts learned by candlelight, and memory of people loved and lost, both entrusted somehow to the very same quiet, fragrant plant. There is a soft comfort in a herb that was once asked to hold two such different kinds of remembering, and somehow, through all those centuries, managed to be trusted with both at once, never once seeming to strain beneath the weight of either. Perhaps that is what made rosemary feel so trustworthy in the first place: its willingness to be useful in whatever small way was asked of it, without complaint, without needing to be anything grander than a modest evergreen shrub growing quietly at the edge of a garden path, waiting to be noticed by whoever happened to walk by with a heavy heart or a nervous mind. Somewhere tonight, in a kitchen you will never see, a sprig of rosemary is likely resting on a cutting board, waiting to be tucked beside a roasting dish, carrying forward without any fanfare at all, a habit older than most of the languages spoken on this earth. Rosemary's needle-like leaves stayed green through every season, unlike so many other plants that softened and browned with the turning year. And perhaps that quiet permanence is part of what made it feel so suited to memory in the first place. while gardens around it faded and returned. Rosemary simply endured, holding its color through cold months the way a memory, if tended carefully enough, might hold its shape through the passing of many ordinary years. Cooks, too, valued rosemary long before anyone separated the kitchen from the medicine cabinet, since in the ancient world there was often no real separation between the two at all. A sprig tucked into roasting meat did double duty, flavoring a meal while quietly, almost invisibly, offering whatever benefit the diners believed it carried. Food and remedy sat together on the same plate, prepared by the same careful hands, trusted for the same simple reasons. Even the shape of a rosemary bush seemed to suggest steadiness, low, dense, woody at its base, capable of surviving drought, wind, and years of neglect, while still producing its narrow, fragrant leaves each spring without fail. Gardeners who otherwise struggled with more delicate plants could usually count on rosemary to endure, and perhaps that quiet reliability became part of its reputation too. A plant that refused to give up easily seemed a fitting companion for memory itself, which so many ancient people hoped, quietly and without ever quite saying it aloud, might also refuse to fade too easily with time. Wedding customs in later centuries borrowed rosemary as well, woven into bridal wreaths and pressed into the hands of guests, carrying its old meaning of remembrance into an entirely new kind of ceremony. A marriage meant to be remembered, a promise meant to be kept in mind long after the flowers of the day had wilted and been swept away. The same plant that once sat behind a student's ear during a nervous examination found itself, centuries later, resting instead in the hair of a bride on her wedding morning, its purpose shifting slightly with each new context while its underlying meaning stayed remarkably constant. Hold on to this. Remember this. Do not let this slip quietly away. It is a gentle thing to think of one small evergreen herb asked, across so many centuries and so many completely different circumstances, to perform the very same fundamental task, to help human beings hold onto what mattered to them for just a little while longer than memory alone might have allowed. And there is comfort, too, in knowing that these small green traditions were never really about grand discovery. They were about attention. Someone somewhere paid close attention to a flower, a leaf, a root, a rising curl of smoke, and noticed quietly that it helped. That noticing was passed on, hand to hand, generation to generation, long before anyone thought to write it down. It is still being passed on tonight in this very telling to you. The night is still young, and there is still so much quiet green knowledge left to wander through together. If your eyes have grown heavy already, that is not a failure of attention. That is exactly what this story is for. Let the next 5 gardens drift past you the way clouds drift past a window. Noticed, gently, without any need to hold onto every detail, without any need to remember a single name by morning. Valerian root was gathered from damp meadows and riverbanks across ancient Greece and later Rome. Its small pink and white flowers pretty enough to seem harmless, giving no hint of the strange, earthy power healers believed lay hidden in the root beneath. Physicians of the ancient world dug it carefully from the soil, washed away the clinging dirt, and dried it slowly until it developed a scent many found unusual, deep, musky, almost like old wood and damp earth mingled together. That smell was not for everyone. Even in antiquity, some found it strange, even unpleasant. And yet it was trusted precisely because of what it did afterward. Once steeped into a warm drink and offered to someone whose mind simply would not stop turning. There is a quiet symmetry in beginning this next stretch of our journey with a root, after ending the last with a leaf held behind a scholar's ear. Where rosemary asked the mind to hold on, to remember, valerian asks the very opposite, to let go, to release, to allow the thoughts of the day to finally loosen their grip. Both requests, in their own way, are acts of care, offered to a mind that has worked hard enough for one day and deserves now to simply rest, without needing to hold onto a single thing more tonight. Picture an ancient household long after supper has ended, the fire burned down to embers, most of the house already dark and quiet. Someone lies awake anyway, thoughts circling without permission, the ordinary worries of the day refusing to loosen their grip even now, in the stillness meant for rest. A healer or a grandmother, moving with the quiet confidence of long practice, prepares a small cup of valerian root steeped in warm water, offering it not as medicine exactly, but as permission to finally let go of the thoughts that have been circling for hours. There would have been no hurry in this small ritual. The water needed to be warmed slowly, never rushed to a boil, and the dried root needed time to release itself fully into the liquid, its color deepening gradually from clear to a soft amber brown. Whoever prepared it likely sat nearby during this waiting, perhaps mending cloth by firelight, or simply resting their own tired hands, letting the quiet minutes of preparation become their own small pause in an otherwise long and demanding day. The cup, once finally offered, carried within it not only the root's effect but the whole unhurried process of its making, proof, in liquid form, that someone had taken the time to care. You might notice, if you let yourself, that your own breathing has already begun to match something of that same unhurried rhythm. There is no need to hurry toward sleep tonight, any more than an ancient healer hurried the steeping of a root. It will arrive in its own quiet time, drawn out gently, the way warmth is slowly drawn out of a dried root left patiently resting in warm water. There is something almost tender in the idea that people so long ago recognized this particular kind of suffering, the restless mind at the hour it most needs to rest, and built, patiently, a remedy for it out of nothing more than a root pulled from damp soil. They could not have explained why it worked in any way we would recognize today. They only knew from repetition, from trust passed down through countless quiet nights, that it did. Ancient Greek physicians wrote about valerian under a different name, describing its effects with the careful, methodical language they applied to many remedies, noting its usefulness for those whose minds seemed unable to settle even in physical stillness. This distinction mattered to them. A body could be perfectly still, resting in bed, and yet a mind could remain fully awake, circling and circling without permission, refusing the rest the body so clearly needs. Aided, valerian was understood specifically as a remedy for this gap between a tired body and a wakeful mind. A gap that anyone lying awake tonight might recognize immediately, even across a distance of 2,000 years, even across every difference of language and custom that separates now from then. Valerian's reputation traveled onward long after Rome itself had faded, carried into medieval monasteries, and later into the herb gardens of ordinary households across Europe, where it became known by names that roughly translated to something like all heal, a title that spoke less to any single miraculous property, and more to how broadly it was trusted across so many different complaints. Sleeplessness, nervous tension, a racing heart before difficult news, valerian was reached for again and again, not because any single physician had proven it beyond doubt, but because enough ordinary people, across enough ordinary nights, had found in it something that helped. Its unusual scent, so distinct from the sweeter herbs that surrounded it in most gardens, may have been part of what made it feel so serious, so purposeful to those who relied on it. Sweetness suggests pleasure. This deep, earthy smell suggested something else entirely. The smell of soil itself, of something pulled directly from the ground rather than grown delicately above it, as though its power came not from light and air but from something older and more hidden, gathered patiently in darkness, the way sleep itself is gathered, night after night in darkness of its own, quietly and without complaint, the same way it will be gathered again tonight for you. There is an old saying, repeated in various forms across several herbal traditions, that the strongest remedies rarely announce themselves through pleasant fragrance alone. Valerian became something of a proof for this idea, its unglamorous smell standing in sharp contrast to its widely trusted effect, a reminder that comfort does not always arrive wrapped in something immediately appealing. Sometimes it arrives instead in something plain, something earthy, something a person must learn to trust before they learn to enjoy. Much the way rest itself can feel unfamiliar and strange to a mind that has forgotten, through too many restless nights, what it actually feels like to properly let go. Cats, interestingly, responded to valerian root with an enthusiasm entirely different from the calm it offered humans. A curious detail recorded by observant households across many centuries, who noticed their animals behaving with sudden, playful energy around the very same root that settled human minds toward sleep. Ancient households likely found this contrast amusing even then, watching a plant produce such opposite effects in different creatures sharing the very same home. A small reminder that the natural world rarely behaves in ways that fit into tidy, predictable patterns. Herbalists across many centuries have offered various explanations for this curious difference, though none fully agreed upon even now, and perhaps that lingering mystery is itself part of the charm. A single root, growing from the very same damp soil, capable of settling one creature toward stillness while stirring another toward playful energy. It is the kind of small, harmless contradiction that makes the natural world feel endlessly, gently surprising, even after so many long centuries of careful observation. Perhaps it is fitting, too, that a plant meant to calm human minds should carry, alongside its quiet gift, a small private joke shared only with the household cat curled somewhere nearby, purring contentedly through the very same quiet hours meant for human rest. Even now, in quiet corners of the world, someone is steeping valerian root in warm water at the end of a long and difficult day, trusting a plant whose strange, earthy scent has carried the exact same promise of rest for well over 2,000 years. Valerian's cultivation required a particular kind of patience that many gardeners found unusual compared to sweeter, showier herbs. The root needed 2 full years in the ground before it developed its characteristic strength, meaning anyone who planted it was, in effect, planting for a future self, or more often, for someone else entirely. A neighbor, a grandchild, a stranger who might one day need it long after the original planter had forgotten which corner of the garden held it. There is something quietly generous in that kind of gardening, tending something whose full benefit you might never personally receive. Ancient texts occasionally described valerian being placed beneath a pillow rather than steeped into tea, its scent alone thought sufficient to ease a troubled mind through the darkest hours of the night. Whether this practice worked through the root's chemistry or simply through the comfort of ritual and belief, those who followed it reported waking calmer, steadier, as though something patient and unseen had kept watch over their sleep, while they were unable to watch over it themselves. There is a gentleness in imagining a small dried root, tucked quietly beneath a pillow, doing nothing dramatic at all, simply resting there through the night the way a trusted companion rests nearby without needing to speak. No elaborate ceremony, no difficult preparation, just a root, a pillow, and a long, unremarkable night passing quietly by, exactly as it was meant to, undisturbed until morning arrived gently on its own. Lemon balm grew easily within monastery walls, spreading generously along garden borders with little encouragement, its crushed leaves releasing a bright citrus fragrance that seemed to lift the whole surrounding air whenever a passing sleeve brushed against it. Monks in medieval Europe prized it enormously, cultivating it deliberately in the careful, orderly herb gardens that formed the quiet backbone of monastic life, tending each bed with the same unhurried devotion they gave to prayer itself. Some called it the elixir of life, believing it could ease melancholy, calm an anxious heart, and gently lift a spirit weighed down by the long hours of a difficult season. Imagine a monk kneeling in the early morning within a walled garden, dew still clinging to the low green leaves around him, gathering lemon balm into a woven basket before the rest of the monastery has fully woken. The scent released by each cut stem would have followed him back through stone corridors toward the infirmary, bright and unmistakable against the cooler, muskier smells of a medieval building. Stone, smoke, old wood. For a brother resting in the infirmary bed, weakened by illness or simply worn thin by a hard season, that bright citrus scent arriving with the morning tea may have felt like a small, quiet promise that better days were still possible. Medieval manuscripts sometimes describe entire jars of lemon balm preserved in honey, a preparation meant to be spooned directly from the jar during the darkest, coldest months of winter, when fresh herbs were impossible to gather and spirits, understandably, tended to sink alongside the temperature. This preserved sweetness carried summer forward into winter in a very literal sense. A small captured piece of brighter days offered exactly when it was needed most, when the surrounding world outside the monastery walls had gone gray and bare. There is something worth holding onto in that image tonight, the idea that comfort can be preserved, set aside deliberately during a season of abundance, and drawn upon later during a harder one. Perhaps that is part of what these old herbal traditions still offer us now. This same quiet reminder that ease gathered today can be saved, in some small way, for whatever difficult night still lies ahead, waiting patiently in its jar until the exact moment it is finally needed. Lemon balm was steeped alone or blended gently with other calming herbs, offered to those recovering from fever, to those troubled by restless nights, to anyone whose spirits seemed to need lifting rather than sedating. There was a lightness to how it was regarded, distinct from the heavier, earthier remedies reserved for more serious complaints. It asked for very little from those who grew it: a bit of sun, ordinary soil, minimal tending, and gave back generously season after season, far more than its modest requirements might have suggested it could. Some monastery records describe lemon balm being blended specifically with chamomile, the two gentle herbs offered together in a single cup, one calming the body while the other lifted a heavy spirit, working in quiet partnership rather than competing for the same purpose. There is something fitting in imagining these two herbs meeting again here, in this same telling, after chamomile opened our very first garden earlier tonight. The old world's remedies rarely worked in isolation. They were woven together, gently, the way this whole story has been woven together for you, one soft green thread at a time. A particular medieval physician, whose careful garden notes survived by chance across the centuries, described lemon balm as a plant that could renew youth in a tired heart, a phrase that sounds almost fanciful to modern ears, yet captures something true about how a bright, hopeful fragrance can shift a person's inner weather, if only briefly. He recommended it be taken each morning by anyone feeling weighed down by sorrow, a small daily practice of returning, again and again, to a scent capable of gently lifting whatever heaviness the previous day had left behind, one unhurried cup at a time, for as many mornings as it took. Its name carries an old memory of Mediterranean lands within it, borrowed originally from words meaning bee, since the plant's small white flowers drew honeybees from every corner of a monastery garden throughout the warmer months. A garden humming quietly with bees drawn to lemon balm would have felt, too. Those tending it, like proof of something working exactly as it should, a small ecosystem of calm, self-sustaining, needing nothing from the monks beyond patience and a willingness to let the plant simply be what it was. One particular monastery tradition, recorded in fragments across several old texts, describes lemon balm water being splashed gently onto the temples and wrists of anxious visitors before they were permitted to speak with the abbot about troubling matters, a small ritual meant to steady the nerves before difficult conversation. Whether this practice actually calmed anyone in any measurable sense, or simply offered a few extra moments of pause before an anxious exchange, its intention remains clear across the centuries. A recognition that even brief contact with something bright and fragrant could shift, even slightly, the emotional weather of a difficult moment. There is a quiet wisdom in that small pause, in that deliberate moment of delay built into a difficult interaction. So much of what these ancient herbal traditions offered was not instant transformation, but simply permission to slow down, to breathe, to let a fragrance or a warm cup do its patient work before rushing forward into whatever came next. That permission remains just as valuable tonight as it was within those old monastery walls, in a world that has, if anything, grown far less patient with pauses of any kind. There is a particular kind of comfort in a remedy that lifts rather than dulls, that brightens a tired spirit rather than simply numbing it into silence. Lemon balm offered exactly that kind of gentleness, century after century, long before anyone thought to isolate or name the compounds responsible for its effect. Medieval physicians sometimes prescribed lemon balm steeped in wine for those suffering from what they called melancholy of the heart, a phrase broad enough to cover grief, worry, and simple exhaustion all at once. The remedy was gentle enough to be offered daily without concern, unlike stronger substances reserved for only the most severe complaints, and this gentleness made it a household staple rather than an occasional treatment, something reached for as readily as a warm blanket on a cold evening. Records from several medieval herb gardens describe lemon balm being planted deliberately near windows and doorways, so that its bright scent would greet anyone entering or leaving a building throughout the day. Such small, deliberate choices in garden design reveal something tender about how seriously these communities took the emotional atmosphere of their daily surroundings, arranging their plants not only for medicine, but for the quiet, cumulative comfort of simply living alongside something fragrant and calming. Mint spread wherever it was planted, sometimes almost too eagerly, its runners creeping beyond garden borders within a single season if left untended. A plant so vigorous that ancient gardeners sometimes struggled less with growing it and more with containing it. The ancient Greeks and Egyptians both valued it deeply, using it to settle uneasy stomachs, to freshen breath, to ease the discomfort that so often followed a heavy meal or a long day of travel through dust and heat. Its sharp, cool fragrance was unmistakable even from a distance, carried easily on warm air in a way few other herbs could match. Consider a household preparing for guests in ancient Athens. Crushed mint leaves scattered across floors and mixed into washing water. The sharp, fresh scent meant to signal welcome and hospitality before a single word was spoken. Mint served this dual purpose across many ancient cultures: practical remedy and social gesture, medicine and manners intertwined in a single humble plant. A guest offered mint-scented water for washing their hands upon arrival would have understood, without needing to be told, that they were entering a home that valued comfort and care. The plant's very name is said to descend from a nymph of Greek myth, transformed into the fragrant herb we know today. A story that gave mint an air of quiet significance beyond its practical uses. Whether or not any ancient household truly thought of mythology while crushing leaves into their evening meal, the association lingered in language and story, long after the specific myth itself had faded from everyday memory. Another small example of how deeply these plants wove themselves into the imagination, as well as the medicine of the ancient world. Physicians of the ancient world also recommended mint, steeped in warm water for those troubled by restless, uneasy stomachs before sleep, a discomfort that has likely kept humans awake for as long as humans have eaten food that disagreed with them. A simple cup of mint tea, prepared at the end of a difficult meal, could ease that particular unease enough to allow proper rest. A small and unglamorous kindness repeated in countless households across countless centuries. Roman writers disagree. Bed mint being woven into simple crowns worn during certain gatherings and feasts, its fragrance rising gently with the warmth of the body throughout an evening, a quiet perfume that required no additional effort once it was placed. This small custom turned an ordinary garden herb into something almost ceremonial, elevating a plant that grew freely along every roadside into a mark of care and attention when it was gathered deliberately and shaped into something worn close to the skin, close enough that its scent became, for one evening, almost inseparable from the wearer themselves. Mint's cooling sensation on the tongue and skin gave it a reputation quite different from warming herbs like ginger, associated instead with clarity, freshness, and a kind of mental brightening rather than a settling warmth. Students in some ancient traditions chewed mint leaves alongside rosemary, believing the combination sharpened thinking during long hours of study. The cool sharpness of one herb balancing the woody steadiness of the other in a pairing that felt, to those who used it, greater than either plant alone. Ancient physicians also noted that mint seemed to ease headaches when its crushed leaves were pressed gently against the forehead. A simple remedy requiring nothing more than a few leaves and a moment of stillness while the coolness slowly took effect. This small, unhurried act of self-care, sitting quietly with crushed leaves pressed against tired skin, waiting patiently for relief rather than expecting it instantly, feels, in its own way, like a fitting metaphor for so much of ancient herbal wisdom altogether. Nothing was rushed. Nothing promised to work in a single instant. Everything simply asked for a small measure of patience, offered in return for a small measure of relief. Travelers along ancient trade roads sometimes chewed mint leaves specifically to mask thirst during long stretches without fresh water. The cooling sensation on the tongue, offering a strange kind of comfort even when no actual water was available to drink. This small trick, passed between travelers long before any formal understanding of why it worked, speaks to just how resourceful and observant ordinary people were, noticing subtle bodily sensations and finding ways to gently influence them, using nothing more than the plants growing freely around them. Mint's tendency to spread so eagerly through a garden also gave it an unusual reputation, as a plant almost impossible to lose entirely, one that would return year after year even through neglect, drought, or the passing of whoever had originally planted it. Households that moved or changed hands across generations would often find mint still thriving somewhere along a forgotten wall long after every other cultivated plant had vanished. A small green constant, patiently waiting to be rediscovered by whoever happened to walk that overgrown corner of the garden next, unbothered by how many years had passed since anyone last tended it. Even now, that same cool sharpness greets anyone who crushes a fresh mint leaf between their fingers, unchanged across every century that separates a modern kitchen from an ancient Athenian courtyard, the scent itself acting as a small and reliable bridge across all that lost and forgotten time. The ancient Egyptians pressed mint into their own remedies as well, recording its uses on papyri alongside other trusted plants, treating it as a dependable answer to digestive troubles long before the Greeks adopted many of the same practices. Trade and shared knowledge moved slowly across the ancient Mediterranean, herb by herb, remedy by remedy, until many cultures ended up trusting the very same plants for remarkably similar reasons, even without direct contact between every civilization involved. There was a particular comfort, too, in mint's resilience. A gardener who lost an entire season's harvest of more delicate herbs to drought or frost could usually still find mint thriving somewhere along a damp wall or shaded corner, stubbornly persistent regardless of neglect. Perhaps that reliability, more than any single property, is what made it such a constant presence across so many ancient households. Not the most dramatic remedy in the garden, but the one you could always count on being there. Thyme grew low and hardy across dry Mediterranean hillsides, its tiny purple flowers easy to overlook individually but unmistakable in mass. Entire slopes sometimes turning faintly violet during its flowering season, visible from a considerable distance to anyone walking the old roads below. Ancient Greek temples burned thyme as incense, its smoke believed to carry courage toward those who breathed it, a quality distinct from the clarity attributed to sage or the calm attributed to chamomile. Soldiers preparing for difficult undertakings, and ordinary people facing hard decisions, sometimes turned to thyme specifically for this reason, hoping its rising smoke might steady trembling resolve. Picture a small temple courtyard at dusk, thyme smoldering in a shallow bronze dish, its smoke curling upward pale and fragrant against a darkening sky. Those gathered nearby would have breathed it in slowly, deliberately, treating the act itself as a kind of quiet ceremony rather than a casual habit. There was an expectation, unspoken but widely shared, that courage of this kind could not be rushed. It had to be breathed in gradually, allowed to settle, much the way calm itself settles slowly rather than arriving all at once. The Greek word for thyme is thought by some scholars to relate to an older root meaning to fumigate or to sacrifice, tying the plant linguistically to acts of purification and offering long before anyone recorded a formal explanation of why. Language itself, in this case, preserved a memory of ritual use that might otherwise have been lost entirely. A small linguistic fossil embedded quietly within a word people still use today without ever considering its ancient weight. A whisper of old smoke carried forward inside a single ordinary syllable. Thyme also found its way into ancient bathing rituals alongside lavender, and Roman writers noted its use in massage oils meant to ease sore, tired muscles after long days of physical labor or travel. Its sharp, slightly peppery fragrance would have mingled with lavender's softer sweetness in these oils, creating a scent that was neither purely calming nor purely invigorating, but something balanced between the two, steady rather than sedating, alert rather than anxious. Farmers along dry hillsides learned that thyme required almost nothing from the soil it grew in, thriving in rocky, poor ground where little else could take root at all. This hardiness made it one of the most reliable plants a household could count on, gathered freely without concern for careful cultivation, always present on the hillside, whenever it was needed, through drought, through hard winters, through years when more delicate garden plants simply failed to return. There is something quietly moving in the idea of an ancient soldier or traveler carrying thyme not for its taste, but for its promise, trusting that a small hardy flower growing wild on a rocky hillside might somehow help steady a frightened heart before something difficult. Courage, in this old understanding, was not the absence of fear. It was something that could be gently supported, nurtured almost, the way a small flame is nurtured and protected until it grows steady enough to hold on its own. Beekeepers across the ancient Mediterranean prized time-covered hillsides above almost any other landscape. Since honey gathered from bees that fed primarily on thyme blossoms carried a distinctive flavor considered among the finest available anywhere in the ancient world. This honey, in turn, was sometimes used to sweeten medicinal preparations made from other, less pleasant-tasting herbs, meaning thyme found its way into countless remedies indirectly, hidden within the sweetness of honey rather than announced by its own sharp fragrance. There is a quiet elegance in imagining an entire hillside working together this way. Small purple flowers, patient bees moving from blossom to blossom, and the resulting honey later sweetening a bitter tincture meant to ease someone's fever far away in a village the bees themselves would never see. Nothing about this process was designed. It simply happened, season after season, the natural rhythms of one landscape quietly supporting the well-being of people who may never have fully understood just how many small, connected steps stood between a wildflower and their evening remedy, each one patient, each one unhurried, each one utterly indifferent to being noticed or thanked. Roman soldiers reportedly bathed in water infused with thyme before difficult campaigns, believing it would grant them vigor as well as courage. A small ritual performed quietly before the far louder rituals of battle itself began. There is something worth pausing on in imagining hardened soldiers, men trained for violence, taking a moment beforehand to soak in water, scented with a small purple wildflower, trusting that softness and strength were never truly opposites at all. This same pairing of gentleness and resolve appears again and again across many cultures that valued thyme, as though the plant had come to represent a particular kind of quiet fortitude, not the loud, aggressive courage of a battle cry, but something steadier, something closer to simple willingness. The willingness to face a difficult morning, the willingness to keep walking a long, uncertain road, the willingness even to finally close one's eyes at the end of a hard day and trust that rest would come, however slowly. Thyme, in this sense, was never really about grand heroics. It was about the smaller, daily courage required simply to keep going, one ordinary hour after another. Wild thyme still grows. Across many of those same Mediterranean hillsides today, largely untouched by centuries of change, releasing the very same peppery fragrance into the very same warm evening air whenever a foot happens to brush against it. It requires no memory of ancient temples or old rituals to keep doing what it has always done. It simply continues, quietly, hillside after hillside, offering its small, steady fragrance to anyone who happens to pass by, exactly as it has for longer than anyone can fully account for, indifferent entirely to whether anyone is there to notice or not. Passion Flower's story begins much later and much further away, among the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had long understood and used this striking, intricate flower for its calming properties centuries before European travelers ever encountered it. Its blossom is unlike almost any other flower on earth, a complex arrangement of delicate rings and thread-like petals radiating outward from its center, so unusual in appearance that later visitors struggled to describe it using any familiar botanical language at all. Indigenous healers steeped its leaves and vines into gentle teas offered to those troubled by anxious, restless minds, understanding its calming effect long before any formal record of that knowledge existed in writing. Imagine an indigenous healer moving through a warm, humid landscape, thick with vines and undergrowth, searching out passion flower where it climbed along fences of trees and forest edges, its unusual blossoms scattered among ordinary green leaves like small, complicated stars. The plant was gathered with the same quiet patience found in every tradition we have wandered through tonight, prepared carefully, and offered to those who needed its gentle, steadying effect, whether from grief, fear, or simply the ordinary weight of a difficult season. The vine itself grew with a restless, searching energy, sending out tendrils in every direction until it found something to climb, wrapping itself gently around fence posts, low branches, and the trunks of nearby trees. There is something quietly fitting in a plant so associated with calm having grown, in its natural state, with such determined, searching movement, as though even the plant itself understood something about restlessness before offering its remedy to those who felt it too. Its flowers opened only briefly, often for a single day before wilting, each blossom a fleeting, intricate event rather than a lasting decoration. Healers who understood the plant's rhythm timed their gathering carefully around this brief window, aware that patience and attentiveness mattered as much here as with any other herb we have wandered through tonight. A flower that gives itself so briefly asks in return to be noticed fully while it lasts, not so different perhaps from the fleeting, precious hours of rest we are all reaching for tonight, hours that deserve, in their own quiet way, to be noticed and honored just as fully while they gently, briefly last. When European travelers eventually encountered passion flower, they were struck first by its unusual appearance rather than its calming properties, and it took considerably longer for its gentle effects to become widely recognized and adopted beyond the communities who had always known and trusted it. This is true of a great deal of herbal knowledge across history, properties understood deeply and completely within one tradition, taking generations, sometimes centuries, to be recognized and respected more widely beyond it. Early botanical illustrators struggled to render passion flower accurately, its layered structure so unlike the simpler blossoms they were accustomed to sketching, and several early drawings show a kind of careful bewilderment in how the artist approached each ring of delicate thread-like petals. There was something almost humbling in a flower this small managing to outpace, for a time, the drawing skills of trained naturalists sent specifically to document the natural wonders of a newly encountered land. Complexity, it turned out, could hide within something no larger than the palm of a hand, patient and intricate, waiting quietly to be understood properly. Later generations of herbalists, once passion flower's calming properties finally became more widely documented and trusted, began recommending it specifically for the kind of racing, looping thoughts that arrive most often at night, when the ordinary business of the day no longer offers any distraction from them. In this way, Passion Flower's story eventually circled back toward something we heard earlier this evening in Valerian's own quiet history: different plants, different continents, different centuries, yet arriving, again and again, at the very same understanding of what a troubled mind most needs at the hour it is finally asked to rest, quietly and without protest. There is something worth sitting with in that quiet fact as we near the end of tonight's fifth story. So much comfort in this world has already been discovered, tested, and trusted by someone, somewhere, long before it reaches whoever finally needs it most. Passion Flower's calm was never new at all. It was simply waiting, patiently climbing along forest edges, for the rest of the world to slow down enough to notice what indigenous healers had known all along, quietly, for generations. Spanish missionaries who later encountered the flower in the Americas reportedly saw within its unusual structure a resemblance to elements of the crucifixion story. And this is how the plant eventually received the name it carries in many languages today, layered over its original meaning with an entirely different set of associations from an entirely different tradition. And yet underneath that layer of borrowed meaning, the plant itself never changed. It continued doing exactly what it had always done, offering its quiet, calming effect to anyone patient enough to gather and prepare it properly, regardless of what story was told about its shape. There is a lesson, gentle and unhurried, in how many names a single plant can gather across its long history, each civilization seeing something slightly different in the very same climbing vine, and yet each one, in its own way, arriving at the same fundamental discovery: that here, in this unusual flower, was something capable of easing a troubled mind toward rest. Perhaps that is the quiet thread running beneath everything we have wandered through this evening. Different lands, different centuries, different names, different rituals, different reasons offered for why a particular root or leaf or blossom seemed to help. And yet, underneath all that difference, the very same simple human need kept reappearing, again and again. The need to find some small measure of calm at the end of a long day, some gentle way to release the thoughts that circle too tightly, some quiet permission to finally rest. That need has not changed, even now, even here, even in whatever quiet room you happen to be resting in tonight. The gardens have changed, the names have changed, but the need itself has traveled forward, patient and unbroken, connecting you to every healer, every monk, every tired traveler we have met so far this evening, all of them reaching in their own time and their own way for exactly the same quiet comfort you are reaching for now, in this very room, in this very moment. Rest now for a moment in that thought alone. There is still more of this old green story left to tell, more quiet gardens still waiting for us. But nothing about them needs to be rushed toward. They will still be there, patient as ever, whenever you are ready to continue drifting through them, whether that is tonight or some other quiet night still waiting ahead, somewhere further down the calendar than either of us can quite see from here, and that is perfectly fine. Hops climbed the wooden trellises of medieval brewhouses long before anyone associated the plant with rest rather than drink. Its pale green cone-shaped flowers, gathered each autumn by hands practiced in knowing exactly when the harvest was truly ready. Monks were among the very first in Europe to cultivate hops deliberately, growing them alongside their other quiet herbs within monastery walls, at first valuing the plant primarily for the bitter, preserving quality it lent to brewed beverages. It took real time and careful observation before anyone finally noticed something quieter happening alongside that bitterness, a heaviness in the limbs, a softening of restless thought, a gentle pull toward sleep that always seemed to arrive along with the drink itself. We begin this final, gentlest garden a little differently than the others, not beside a river or within a temple courtyard, but climbing upward along a wooden trellis, reaching quietly toward the low autumn sun the way every patient thing in this story eventually learns to do, one slow season at a time, never once in a hurry to arrive anywhere at all. Picture a monastery brewhouse in the low light of early evening, the air thick with the warm, slightly resinous smell of hops steeping in great copper vessels, steam curling upward toward wooden rafters blackened by decades of the very same gentle work. A monk tending the process would have breath that sent for hours at a stretch, and it is easy to imagine him growing calmer simply from the steady, repetitive labor and the fragrance surrounding him, long before a single drop was ever poured or tasted. Some herbalists eventually began separating the calming property from the brewing altogether, stuffing dried hop flowers into small cloth pillows meant to be tucked beside a sleepless head, offering their gentle heaviness without any drink required at all. The brewhouse itself would have followed its own unhurried rhythm through the year, quiet during the summer months, then slowly waking each autumn as the harvest came in. Wooden vats scrubbed clean and readied, the whole building filling gradually with a warmth and fragrance that must have felt, to those who worked there year after year, like the true beginning of the colder season far more than any date on a calendar, a signal written in scent rather than in numbers. There is something quietly clever in that discovery, realizing that a plant's calming gift did not need to travel through the stomach to reach a restless mind, that simply resting near its scent through the night might be enough. Hop pillows became a modest tradition in several parts of Europe, filled and refilled each season with the fresh green cones, releasing their soft, slightly earthy fragrance into the darkness of a bedroom the way lavender or valerian might, only quieter, only closer to the exact spot where a tired head finally comes to rest. It is worth noting how patient hops truly are as a plant, climbing slowly upward each season along whatever support is offered, gaining height gradually rather than all at once, never rushing toward the sun the way some more urgent vines might. That unhurried upward climb feels, in hindsight, strangely fitting for a plant that would eventually become known for slowing a restless mind down to the very same unhurried pace, coaxing thought to climb gently toward rest rather than racing anywhere at all. German brewing traditions in particular developed an especially close relationship with hops, and records from several old brewing towns describe entire families whose work revolved around the seasonal rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting the tall green vines each year. Children in these families would have grown up surrounded by the plant's distinctive fragrance from an early age, present in the fields during harvest, present in the brewhouse during the slow simmering months, present even in the fabric of clothing worn during the busiest weeks of the working year. For them, that resinous, slightly bitter scent likely carried none of the mystery it might hold for someone encountering it for the first time. It simply meant home, meant family, meant the turning of another familiar season. Harvest time itself demanded a particular kind of teamwork, whole families moving together through rows of tall trellised vines, cutting the heavy, fragrant strings of hop cones down carefully so as not to bruise the delicate flowers before they could be properly dried. Older relatives often took on the task of judging exactly when each vine was ready, a skill developed over decades of careful observation, reading small signs in the color and texture of the cones that a younger, less experienced eye might easily overlook entirely. There was pride in that kind of expertise, quietly passed down through demonstration rather than instruction, the way so much of this evening's old knowledge found its way from one generation into the next, hand guiding hand, season after patient season, until the skill itself became simply part of who a family was. Herbalists eventually began recommending hop tea specifically, brewed without any of the fermentation involved in beer making, offered instead as a mild, direct preparation meant purely to encourage rest. This distinction mattered enormously to those who valued the plant medicinally rather than socially, separating its calming property entirely from its long association with drinking and gathering, presenting it instead as something quieter, something meant to be taken alone, in the private stillness of a bedroom rather than the shared noise of a tavern. There is a gentle irony worth noticing in how a single plant could hold two such different reputations at once, boisterous and communal in one context, hushed and solitary in another, and yet remain, underneath both, exactly the same plant doing exactly the same patient work. Perhaps that duality is simply part of what makes an old herb feel so alive across centuries, adaptable enough to serve an evening of laughter and a night of quiet rest with equal, unassuming ease. Even the pillow itself, stuffed with dried hop cones and left to rest quietly beside a sleepless head, carries forward something of that same duality tonight, a small echo of the brewhouse's warm, sociable evenings, folded gently into the private hush of a single darkened room. Skullcap grew quietly across woodland edges and damp meadows in what is now North America, long known and carefully used by various indigenous peoples for its calming effect on a troubled nervous system, well before European settlers ever learned its name or its properties. Traditional healers gathered its small blue-hooded flowers and slender stems with the same unhurried respect given to every other plant we have wandered through this evening, understanding it as a remedy for nervous tension, for a mind pulled too tight by worry, for the kind of trembling unease that can settle into a body after a difficult loss or a frightening event. There is a hush that seems to belong naturally to this second story of the evening, matching the quiet woodland clearings where the plant itself has always preferred to grow, half hidden beneath taller grasses, patient and unhurried, waiting for exactly the right hands to notice it, exactly the right quiet moment to be found. Imagine a healer moving quietly through a damp woodland clearing at the edge of summer, gathering skullcap, where it grew low among taller grasses, its small hooded flowers easy to miss, unless a person already knew precisely where and how to look. This kind of knowledge, knowing exactly which small, unassuming plant among hundreds of similar green stems actually held the desired property, took generations to accumulate and pass down, tested patiently through direct experience long before anyone thought to write any of it into a book at all. The plant's unusual name comes from the curious shape of its small flower, said to resemble a tiny hood or cap when viewed closely, a detail that would only have been noticed by someone who had spent considerable quiet time studying the plant up close, turning it gently in careful fingers rather than simply glancing at it from a distance. There is something tender in imagining that first observation. Whoever made it crouched low in a damp meadow, noticing a small resemblance that no one else around them had yet thought to name. That kind of noticing takes a particular quality of attention, the sort that only comes from spending real, unhurried time with a landscape rather than passing quickly through it. Whoever first named skullcap for its small hooded shape had likely spent countless hours among the very same woodland plants across many seasons, growing familiar enough with their ordinary forms to recognize. Finally, the one small, unusual detail that set this particular flower apart from everything growing around it, a small, quiet discovery earned only through patience. Later herbalists across many different traditions eventually came to trust skullcap specifically for nervous exhaustion, for the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from physical labor, but from sustained worry, from a mind that has been braced too long against some difficult circumstance. It asked for patience in its preparation, steeped gently rather than boiled hard, its delicate properties easily diminished by too much heat or haste. One more reminder, among so many tonight, that the gentlest remedies often ask for the gentlest handling in return. 19th century herbal physicians eventually began cultivating skullcap more widely, having learned of its properties through generations of accumulated indigenous knowledge, and it found its way gradually into apothecary shelves far from the woodland clearings where it had first been gathered and understood. This transition, so common across the history of herbal medicine, carried with it an uncomfortable truth worth acknowledging quietly tonight. That knowledge, developed with great care over countless generations, was often adopted by others without full recognition of where it had originally come from, or of the patient observation that had made it possible in the first place. Traditional preparation methods varied quite considerably between different indigenous communities across the plant's wide natural range, each one developing its own particular approach to gathering, drying, and steeping the delicate stems and flowers, shaped by local knowledge of the specific growing conditions found in their own particular woodlands and meadows. This diversity of practice, largely lost or flattened in later, more standardized herbal literature, reflected generations of independent, careful observation happening simultaneously across a wide and varied landscape, each community arriving at its own trusted methods through patient trial and attentive memory, rather than through any shared written record. It matters, even in a story meant gently for rest, to hold that history with honesty rather than smoothing it over entirely, to let the truth of it settle alongside the comfort itself. The comfort skullcap offers tonight exists because someone, long ago, in a specific place, among a specific people, noticed something true about a small blue-hooded flower and chose to remember it, to test it, and to pass it carefully onward, one patient generation at a time, long before any of it reached the quiet room you are resting in now. That patient observation deserves to be remembered alongside the remedy itself, not separated from it, especially on a night like this one, when the remedy has traveled so far, through so many careful hands, simply to reach whoever needed it next. St. John's wort took its name from the summer feast day near which its bright yellow flowers reliably bloomed, appearing across meadows and roadsides each year, with a consistency that ancient and medieval observers found remarkable enough to build an entire tradition around. Calm. Unities across Europe gathered it specifically around the summer solstice, weaving it into garlands, hanging it above doorways, and burning small bundles of it in bonfires meant to mark the year's longest day, believing the plant carried some of the sun's own protective, brightening quality within its small golden petals. Our third garden of the evening arrives, fittingly, at the very brightest point of the year, a small golden flower standing at the opposite end of light and dark from the woodland shade where skullcap prefers to grow, and yet reaching, in its own way, toward exactly the same quiet human need for steadiness, the same simple wish to feel held through whatever season a person happens to be moving through. Picture villagers gathering quietly at dusk on a warm midsummer evening, small fires already crackling gently at the edges of a field. Bundles of St. John's wort passed hand to hand and tossed gently into the flames, its faintly resinous scent rising to join wood smoke drifting upward into a sky not yet fully dark. There would have been singing, most likely, and the low murmur of neighbors catching up on a year's worth of small news, all of it wrapped in the particular golden light of a solstice evening that would not fully fade until very late into the night. Healers separately valued the plant for a very different purpose, steeping its flowers into oils and tinctures offered to those whose spirits had grown heavy through a hard season, a use that persisted quietly alongside its more festive solstice traditions for centuries. There was a certain poetry in a single plant serving both purposes at once, celebrated publicly at midsummer bonfires, and trusted privately in quieter moments by anyone whose inner world had grown a little too dim and needed something bright to lean against. The oil pressed from its flowers took on a deep, almost startling red color as it steeped slowly in the sun over several weeks, a transformation that must have seemed remarkable to those preparing it for the first time, watching a pale golden petal quietly stain an entire jar of oil the color of dark wine. Healers timed this steeping carefully, setting jars on sunlit windowsills through the height of summer, turning them occasionally, waiting with the same unhurried patience that runs through so much of what we have wandered through together tonight, trusting the slow work of sunlight and time over anything hurried or forced. Its slender leaves, when held up gently toward light, reveal countless tiny translucent dots scattered evenly across their surface, almost like small windows letting sunlight pass directly through the leaf itself, a detail early observers found significant enough to shape entire theories about the plant's protective power. Whether or not that particular explanation held up to later scrutiny, the image itself remains a lovely one to carry into sleep tonight. A leaf so willing to let light pass straight through it that it seems, even now, faintly illuminated from within. Medieval households sometimes hung small bundles of St. John's wort above windows and doorways year-round, not only during the solstice festival itself, trusting that its presence alone offered some quiet, ongoing protection to whoever passed beneath it. This small daily ritual, repeated without much ceremony, speaks to how deeply certain plants became woven into the fabric of ordinary domestic life, present not as an occasional remedy reached for during crisis, but as a constant, unremarkable companion tucked quietly into the architecture of home itself. Farmers also watched the plant closely, season after season, for practical, agricultural reasons entirely separate from its symbolic associations, since its reliable blooming period offered a natural marker for timing other seasonal tasks across the farming calendar. When St. John's wort bloomed along the field edges, certain crops were known to be ready for a particular stage of tending, and certain preparations for the coming harvest were understood to need beginning soon. In this way, the plant served as something like a living calendar, long before printed calendars were common in most households. Its golden blossoms doing quiet, practical work, far beyond any protective or medicinal purpose alone, marking the turning of a season with the same unhurried reliability as a linden tree, or a hillside of blooming thyme, or any of the other quiet green markers of time we have wandered past together tonight. Herbalists cautioned, even in old texts, that the oil needed careful storage away from direct light. Once it was finally strained and bottled, its deep red color gradually fading if left carelessly exposed. A small practical detail that speaks to how seriously these preparations were handled even in households without any formal medical training. Care, in this old tradition, extended well beyond the moment of harvest, following the remedy all the way through its storage and its eventual careful use, right up until the exact evening it was finally needed and gently, carefully offered. There is comfort in imagining a household that never had to think twice about whether protection and brightness were present nearby, because a small golden flowered bundle had simply always hung above the door, renewed each summer without needing to be requested or explained, understood by every member of the household as simply part of how a home was properly kept. The poppy carried perhaps the oldest and most complicated reputation of any plant we will meet tonight. Cultivated in the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, long before written history began recording the details of daily life there. Sumerian tablets, among the very earliest written records humanity possesses, refer to the poppy using a phrase that roughly translates to something like the joy plant, a name that speaks to how deeply and how early people came to associate this delicate flower with relief from suffering and with the particular, heavy stillness that follows deep rest. Our fourth garden this evening asks for a slightly different quality of attention than the others, gentle still, but touched with a certain old seriousness, the way a grandparent's voice might soften and slow slightly when a story turns toward something that deserves particular care, something worth handling gently, worth taking seriously, even within a story built otherwise for rest. Picture an ancient garden along the fertile banks of a river, running through what is now called the cradle of civilization. Red and white poppy blossoms swaying gently among rows of barley and flax, their papery petals so delicate that a single strong wind could scatter them entirely within a single afternoon. Ancient physicians understood even then that this fragility was deceptive, that something powerful rested quietly within the plant's seed pod, something they treated with tremendous care and considerable caution, aware from early experience that a remedy capable of such deep relief demanded equally deep respect. Farmers tending these gardens would have watched the flowering season pass quickly each year, the vivid red and white blossoms giving way within days to the rounder, sturdier seed pods that healers valued far more than the flowers themselves. This brief flowering window, meant that anyone hoping to witness the poppy fields in full bloom had to time their visit carefully, much like villagers timing their gathering of linden blossoms. Another small reminder scattered throughout tonight's stories that so many of nature's most valued gifts arrive only briefly, asking to be noticed and appreciated within a narrow window, rather than taken for granted as something permanently available. The seed pods themselves, once the petals had scattered, were scored carefully by trained hands using small specialized blades, a precise and deliberate technique passed down through many generations of practiced healers who understood exactly how deep a cut should be, and exactly how much time should pass before the pod's contents could be safely gathered. This was skilled, careful work, never left to chance or performed carelessly, requiring years of guided practice before someone was trusted to perform it entirely on their own. The seriousness with which this single small task was treated tells us a great deal about how the entire ancient world regarded this particular plant, not as an ordinary garden herb to be handled casually, but as something requiring genuine expertise, patience, and respect at every single stage of its careful preparation, from the earliest planting of the seed all the way through to its final, deliberate use. That respect echoed forward across nearly every civilization the poppy touched, from ancient Mesopotamia through Egypt and Greece and beyond, each culture developing its own careful rituals, its own cautious language, its own stories woven around a flower capable of offering such profound and total rest. Greek mythology entwined the poppy closely with Hypnos, the god of sleep, and with his brother Thanatos, imagining the flower as something standing quietly at the threshold between one kind of rest and another, delicate and dangerous in equal measure, deserving neither casual dismissal nor casual use. Ancient Egyptian physicians, working in a tradition entirely separate from the Greek stories that would emerge later, developed their own careful understanding of the plant through direct clinical observation, recording dosages and preparations with a precision that surviving papyri still preserve today. Their approach was methodical rather than mythological, treating the poppy as a serious medical tool requiring exact measurement rather than symbolic reverence, a different cultural lens entirely, yet arriving at the very same underlying respect, that this particular flower asked to be handled with far more care than its delicate appearance might suggest to an untrained eye. It is worth noticing, before we let this particular story rest, how many entirely separate civilizations, Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, and many others beyond them, arrived independently at the very same cautious conclusion about this one delicate flower, without ever comparing notes, without any shared written record connecting their observations across such vast distances. That kind of independent, repeated agreement, appearing again and again across cultures with no direct contact, tends to mean something. It suggests a truth simple and consistent enough that careful observation kept finding it, over and over in garden after garden, century after century, long before anyone thought to write any of it down at all. Statues and small carved figures from several ancient cultures depict deities or revered figures crowned with poppy seed pods rather than more common laurel or olive branches. A detail archaeologists have long connected to the plant's association with peaceful rest and the easing of pain. Such imagery would have carried immediate, unspoken meaning for anyone encountering it in its own time, communicating protection, relief, and gentle passage into rest, without requiring a single word of explanation alongside it. A whole idea folded quietly into the simple shape of a carved stone flower. There is something worth sitting with in how consistently ancient cultures treated this particular flower with such deliberate caution, never fully trusting it, never fully dismissing it either, understanding intuitively what took modern science far longer to properly explain. That the deepest relief and the greatest danger sometimes grow from precisely the same delicate root. Tonight, that old poppy sits quietly at the edge of our garden, a reminder simply held at a respectful distance, its ancient nickname alone enough to close this particular story. Rest, real rest, has always been treated by careful hands as something precious, something never to be rushed or handled carelessly. Ancient physicians documented their caution carefully and deliberately in surviving medical texts, describing precise and limited circumstances under which the plant might be used, always accompanied by clear warnings about excess, about the difference between careful relief and reckless overreach. This careful documentation, preserved across thousands of years despite the fragility of the materials it was written on, reveals a civilization that understood something profound and worth remembering even now, that the most powerful remedies demand the most disciplined respect, and that wisdom about a plant is never complete without equal attention to its limits. The poppy's image appeared, too, in ancient art and poetry, its distinctive papery petals rendered in mosaic and painted pottery, alongside images of sleep and peaceful rest. A visual shorthand ancient audiences would have understood immediately without any need for further explanation. A single red flower, painted small in the corner of some larger scene, could communicate an entire mood, stillness, release, the quiet closing of a difficult day, in a way that required no accompanying words at all. We let that old, cautious flower rest quietly now at the edge of its own story, and turn instead toward one final, gentler garden, warm and communal, waiting to close our evening together properly. Linden blossom, gathered from the fragrant flowering trees that lined so many old European village squares, offered perhaps the gentlest and most communal of all the calming traditions we will wander through tonight. Entire towns organized their summer calendars loosely around the linden's brief flowering window, when its small pale yellow blossoms opened for only a matter of days and filled the surrounding air with a honeyed, unmistakable sweetness that could be smelled from a considerable distance on a warm evening breeze. Picture an entire village square shaded beneath ancient linden trees, generations of the same families having gathered beneath those same broad branches for markets, for festivals, for quiet evening conversation long after the day's work had finally ended. When the trees bloomed each summer, entire households would turn out together to gather the fragrant blossoms, filling baskets and cloth sacks with careful, unhurried hands, working alongside neighbors in a shared task that asked for very little beyond patience and a willingness to stand beneath fragrant branches for an hour or two at the height of a warm afternoon. Our fifth and final garden this evening brings us back, fittingly, to something communal and warm, after wandering through a story that asked for a touch more caution than the others. Here beneath the linden's broad canopy, there is only gentleness waiting, only shade and honeyed fragrance, and the quiet, steady company of neighbors who have gathered in this very same spot for longer than anyone currently standing there could Pearly account for, generation folding softly into generation beneath the very same wide, patient branches. Children, too young to help much with the actual harvest, were often given the simple task of carrying the filled baskets back toward the village center, proud of their small contribution to a task the whole community valued, learning without being taught directly that some of the most important work in a household required no great skill at all, only willing hands and a bit of patience beneath a fragrant tree. Older residents often used the linden harvest as a quiet occasion for storytelling, seated on low stools in whatever shade the trees provided, while younger hands did the actual climbing and gathering, passing down local history and family memory in the same unhurried breath used to explain which branches held the freshest blossoms that particular year. In this way, the linden tree became something like a classroom without walls, a place where practical skill and community memory were taught side by side, neither one considered more important than the other, both simply part of what it meant to belong to a particular village beneath a particular set of ancient, familiar branches, generation folding gently into generation beneath the very same patient canopy. Once dried, linden blossoms were steeped into a tea valued across many generations for its gentle calming effect, offered most often in the evening to children resistant to sleep, to elders troubled by restless nights, to anyone whose day had simply asked too much of their nervous system. Its taste was mild and faintly sweet, welcoming even to those unaccustomed to herbal preparations, which likely contributed to how widely and consistently it was trusted across so many different households and generations. French households in particular developed an especially close relationship with linden tea, keeping dried blossoms on hand through the colder months as carefully as any other household staple, reaching for a cup at the end of a long day, the way another family elsewhere might reach for a cup of chamomile or lemon balm. This small nightly ritual, repeated across countless households for generations, wove linden blossom into the ordinary rhythm of evening life so completely that many families likely never thought of it as a remedy at all, simply as one small, familiar step in the process of winding a day down toward its close. Grandmothers in particular carried this small nightly ritual forward across generations, preparing the very same cup for grandchildren that their own grandmothers had once prepared for them, the recipe requiring no written instruction at all, simply memory and repetition, and the quiet confidence that comes from having performed the very same small gesture 1,000 times before. There is something worth holding onto in that image as we near the close of this whole long journey together. A cup passed forward, unchanged, through hands that will never meet each other, connected only by the same small blossoms and the same quiet hour of the evening, connected, too, by the same simple wish for whoever receives that cup to finally rest. The honeyed scent that filled village squares during the brief blooming season also drew a great many bees, and linden honey became prized in its own right across several regions, valued for a delicate, slightly minty flavor unlike honey gathered from any other blossom. Beekeepers timed their hives deliberately near linden groves when possible, understanding that this particular flowering window, however brief, could yield honey considered among the finest of the entire year. There is a quiet symmetry in ending our long evening together with bees once more, the very same patient creatures who carried time's fragrance into golden honey earlier in this story, now doing the very same careful work beneath linden branches, connecting one of our very first gardens to this, our very last. Nothing in this whole long evening was ever truly separate. Every root, every leaf, every drifting scent has been quietly connected all along, the way this final thought now connects gently back to where we began. One long, unbroken thread of green comfort stretching across every garden we have wandered through tonight. There is a particular tenderness in imagining an entire community, year after year, gathering beneath the very same trees their grandparents had once gathered beneath, harvesting the very same fragrant blossoms for the very same gentle purpose. Linden connected neighbors to each other as much as it connected each drinker to rest itself. A single tree offering shade, fragrance, gathering space, and quiet remedy all at once, asking for nothing in return beyond a few warm afternoons of patient, careful hands each passing summer. Many European towns planted linden trees deliberately at their very center, in the main square where markets were held and public announcements made, so that the tree itself became a kind of living landmark, a meeting point, a shared reference woven into how residents describe their own town to visitors and to each other. Lovers reportedly met beneath linden branches for quiet conversation away from watchful eyes, and elders gathered there in the cooler hours of a summer evening to trade news and old stories, the tree's wide canopy offering shade and privacy in roughly equal measure. Some of these old linden trees are recorded as having lived for many centuries, standing witness to generations of the very same families gathering blossoms beneath branches that had, by the time a great-grandchild came to harvest them, already sheltered a great many harvests before. There is something quietly moving in a single tree, outliving so many of the people who depended on it, offering the very same gentle comfort to each new generation exactly as faithfully as it had offered it to the last, asking for nothing but a little patience each returning summer, and giving back each time so very much more. There is a particular tenderness in imagining an entire community, year after year, gathering beneath the very same trees their grandparents had once gathered beneath, harvesting the very same fragrant blossoms for the very same gentle purpose. Linden connected neighbors to each other as much as it connected each drinker to rest itself. A single tree offering shade, fragrance, gathering space, and quiet remedy all at once, asking for nothing in return beyond a few warm afternoons of patient, careful hands each passing summer. And so we come at last to the gentle end of our journey through these old green gardens. 3 long, quiet nights of wandering finally settling now into a single, unhurried close. Think for a moment of everything we wandered through together tonight, and across the quiet nights before this one, each garden opening gently into the next. Chamomile beside the Nile, its small golden heart trusted by healers who had no word yet for the calm it offered. Lavender rising in steam through Roman bathhouses, carried later into monastery walls where it outlasted the very empire that made it famous. Sage burning slow and silver in temple dishes, believed to hold memory itself steady against the passing of years. Ginger, warm and nobbled, carried across oceans in the pockets of travelers who trusted it before they ever understood why. Rosemary, worn behind a scholar's ear and laid gently at gravesides, asked across centuries to hold onto 2 such different kinds of remembering. There was valerian, too, earthy and unglamorous, tucked beneath pillows through nights we will never know the names of. Lemon balm, bright as citrus, gathered by monks at dawn and preserved in honey through winters that asked too much of tired hearts. Mint, spreading eagerly along every garden wall, offered to guests as a gesture of welcome older than most of what we call history. Time, its purple hillsides feeding both bees and courage in equal measure. Passion flower, climbing quietly along forest edges long before the wider world thought to notice what its earliest healers had always known, patiently, for generations, without ever once needing to be praised for it. And in this final garden, hops climbing slow and patient toward brewhouse rafters, skullcap gathered carefully by hands that understood exactly where to look, St. John's wort blooming bright and reliable each solstice, the old poppy resting cautiously at the edge of every story about deep and dangerous rest, and linden, gentlest of all, gathering entire villages together beneath branches that outlived generations, each one now folded gently, quietly, into this final resting place alongside all the others. Let all of it settle now, gently, quietly, the way dried herbs settle slowly to the bottom of a cup that has been steeping far longer than anyone was watching. You do not need to hold on to a single name from tonight. You do not need to remember which flower belonged to which garden, which root traveled which road, which leaf was pressed to which tired forehead centuries ago. All of that knowledge already did its quiet work simply by passing through you once, the way warmth passes through a cup and into open, waiting hands, asking nothing further of you now than to simply let it go. Let your breathing continue its own slow rhythm now, unhurried, unwatched. Let your body sink a little further into wherever it is resting. There is nothing left to do tonight, nothing to solve, nothing to finish, nothing to prepare for tomorrow that cannot simply wait until morning arrives on its own. You are a part of this old story now, whether you meant to be or not, one more quiet soul, among countless others across thousands of years, reaching gently toward rest with nothing more than a little green comfort held nearby, exactly as so many tired, hopeful hands have reached before you. If you found comfort in these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here, too, one sleepy soul at a time, drifting gently toward these same quiet gardens. If your eyes are still open even now, there may be another quiet video waiting on your screen, ready whenever you are. But there is no hurry there either. Whatever waits will still be waiting, patient as everything else we have wandered through together tonight. Sleep well and good night.